All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Patience Kamau, and I work at the Zehr Institute for Restorative Justice. I will go over a brief agenda of what you can expect in the next 90 minutes. I'll give you a brief introduction to Zoom and how you can interact with the session. Hosts will be introduced by Carl Stauffer, who's going to be hosting the session tonight. We have 3 guests. The presenters will be Aleah and Gretchen and Seth. After they're done talking, we'll have a Q&A session that will be moderated by Dr. Carl Stauffer, and we encourage you to use the Q&A box, but I'll tell you where it is here shortly. And then we will have an announcement toward the end that will be done by Michaela Waters-Crinton, not Lance Simmons. And then we will close at around 6 o'clock. Go ahead. So during the Q&A session, you will see at the very bottom of your screen that you have a chat box right here. But we encourage you to use the Q&A. Do not use the chat feature or the raise hand feature. We need you to use the Q&A, type your question, and Carl will moderate us through the process. He will ask our guests the questions, and they will answer them live or in writing. Thank you so much for being here, and I will hand it over to Carl. Hi, Carl.
Wonderful. Thank you, Patience, and welcome everyone who's tuning in for this webinar. We're really glad to have you, and we're looking forward to I think an enriching and insightful conversation here with our panelists, and so we're up for a treat. My name is Carl Stauffer. I teach here at the Center for Justice and Peace Buildings. I'm Associate Professor of Justice Studies, and I'll be hosting our webinar, the first of our fall series, and we're excited about what's ahead, and we'll be giving you some more announcements about the upcoming webinars for this fall. This evening, we want to look at the webinar, Sustaining Restorative Justice, Exploring Innovative Funding Approaches. And so I just want to say a little bit about that theme before we go on to thank you to introducing our guests. So funding is critical. We know it's critical. It's something we all talk about, but it's something that also frustrates all of us and at times, and sometimes excites us. But it's one of those things that's a necessary discussion, a necessary part of our work, but often we don't know how to get our heads or our hands or our arms around the funding. And also there's a lot of frustrations within the structures of funding. What we wanted to do in this webinar is sort of open up that conversation in a new way, I hope, or at least in a way that will ignite some new thoughts in the minds of all of us as we struggle to work with this thing of how do we fund. And we've been talking a lot here at the Zehr Institute about RJ as a social movement. And so I think if we believe that it's a social movement and the momentum of a movement, it's going to require us to think about new ways to fund the movement. How do you fund a movement? I don't know if you can. We have the women in sight that say the revolution will not be funded. But I think there is a way in which we can partner with funders to make this as creative and sustainable and participatory as possible, and that's what I'm after. I remember working in South Africa, we were being called into a particularly difficult situation in a community where there was a lot of violence, and it was the Swedish SIDA, Swedish International Development Fund, that gave us funding for this project. It was the first time that we had a funder give us funding that said, build relationships. They understood that relationship building was part of our peace building agenda. And that was freeing and allowed us to be much more creative than we possibly could have been if we had the strictures that are normally placed upon funding, especially at that time. That was in the early 1990s, mid-1990s. We've also seen some incredible movement. We've talked about Femble Talk, a transitional restorative justice process happening in Sierra Leone, West Africa. And one of the things that catapulted that movement, which has been going on since 2007, 2008, was a private donor foundation that said, we're going to commit to 15 years of funding to see this thing get off the ground, understanding the extent of what needed to happen for healing justice to go forward. in Sierra Leone. So I name those as just examples of the kind of shift we're seeing in the funding discussion, and that's what we want to be about as we talk today. Really, two things are guiding our conversation. I think one of them is, how do we fund long-term impact or have the impact that we want, and also how do we think about large-scale impact? So there's the long-term in the time view, and then there's also the scaling up. How do we work at both of those and keep the values of restorative justice intact as much as possible, and at the same time see this movement grow? So with me, I'm going to stop talking now, are three incredible guests who can talk to this with much more expertise and experience than I can. So it's my pleasure to introduce Aleah Bacquie Vaughn, and she's the founding director of the Criminal Justice Initiative, CJI. She has a wonderful bio of work in South Africa, and first of all, deputy director at the American Committee on Africa and the Africa Fund, and she championed, for instance, the release of political prisoners, including Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu in the South African context. She's been involved with the Women's Development Foundation, a really important foundation in getting women into government. Aleah has also worked with the Jubilee campaign in the year 2000, to try to cancel African debt, and also has been deeply involved with facilitating the process of medications, ARVs for HIV and AIDS, folks who are living with HIV and AIDS all across the continent. She also worked as the director of social justice ministries at Riverside Church. Many of us would know Riverside Church in the New York City area. And she has advocated all through this for releasing people detained in US facilities, working at mass incarceration issues. She is the proud, fierce mother of 2 Black sons, and we are thankful for your presence here, Aleah, and looking forward to hearing from you. Our second panelist is Seth Weiner, and Seth is a restorative justice enthusiast. I think that's a great description, an advocate based in New York City. Seth and I had the opportunity to work together when he was program officer for the Porticus Foundation, and he was in that position from 2013 to 2017, I believe it was, and worked at pursuing restorative justice, criminal justice reform, immigration reform, homelessness, and wellness in indigenous communities. Weiner lives with his wife, Nok, and 2 baby boys, Shem and Sol. And while he was studying at Loyola Law School, he really got immersed in the Center for Restorative Justice there, and that's where his love for this particular movement of restorative justice began, I believe. And he also carries a degree in community studies from the University of California. And then we have the pleasure of having Gretchen Rohr with us. Gretchen served for many years as a magistrate judge, DC Superior Court, and a powerful position, and yet struggled what it meant to be in that position and not have the power to change the system of mass incarceration all around us. And so Gretchen left that position and joined the Open Society Foundations in 2016, and she's been doing incredible work with grant making and communities, community accountability, harm reduction, diversion resources to end the arrests for drug involvement, sex work, and street economies. She has contributed to the design of rapid response initiatives of the Open Society Foundation's annual selection of Source, Justice, and Equality Fellows. Many of you would know our colleagues and compatriots in the field from the Source, Justice, and Equality Fellowship. Gretchen lectures extensively across the country on these same issues, and thinking about how do we develop alternatives and other ways to think about working with youth and adults, reconciliation, restorative practices, how to stop the incarceration of youth, and building safe communities and healing legal procedures. Gretchen is one of 120 Buddhist leaders nationwide and is a facilitator facilitator with Inside on the Inside. And Gretchen is also a mediator, trained in that, and has been involved with yoga and meditation. She has also been trained through Oxford University and the Rhodes Scholar, and she's looked at reparations issues when it comes to restorative justice. And so she brings just a whole field of incredible experience and and knowledge to our conversation. And I'm just delighted that we could get all three of them together, and I want to welcome them, warmly welcome them to this webinar. The way we're going to move forward after that introduction is I'm going to ask them to each speak briefly on two prompts. Really, what is some of the creative work that they're doing now, and how do each of them, visionaries in their own right, imagine how the funding industry and funding field, funding work could expand and increase in a positive way to see the growth of restorative justice go forward, as many of us would love to imagine in the coming decades. So I'm going to turn it over to Aleah at this point and welcome her to give some input on those two prompts. Aleah?
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. There we go. Can you see me?
We can see you, yeah.
Okay, great.
You might want to turn your volume up just a little bit.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I was having some trouble with my audio. Okay, I'm going to try and switch back there. I apologize. Okay, we'll try this again. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that, folks.
No problem.
What I wanted to do is first to really thank the people with whom I have worked over many years, both in South Africa and here in the United States, that really have shown me the power of a vision of alternatives, what could be, as opposed to what is. And so I feel like that was such a gift to me. I was very, very fortunate to have worked with real luminaries in the field and to have been present at some really strategic times when some decisions were being made about how things were going to go, both here in the United States and in South Africa at critical periods. And I just want to thank many of my mentors for helping me. Reverend Frank Chikani, who followed Archbishop Desmond Tutu as the head of the South African Council of Churches, and also Dumisani Khumalo, who ended up being the first South African ambassador to the United States, Jennifer Davis, who's the head of ACOA, and Brigalia Vaughn, who worked at SACC, and then, of course, also Father Martha Lapsley at the Healing of Memories Institute. So I thank them so much. And then here in the United States, also Wyatt T. Walker, who had the Religious Action Network, and came out of the Civil Rights Movement. I just want to thank all those folks who came before me. First, let me just say I don't in any way claim credit for the phenomenal idea of creating CJI. That was my predecessor, Charlene Allen and Trin Dong, who were staff people at the Funding Exchange, and were approached by David Rosenmiller on behalf of his father, Joe Rosenmiller, to see about starting a fund in which both activists and donors could sit together at the table and reason together about where money should be going to support the movement to end mass criminalization and mass incarceration. So I just want to make that really clear that I inherited that. But when we left the Funding Exchange and moved on to the Solidago Foundation, by that point we had already established some really, I think, very different ways of operating. So we try to make the model of our work an example of what a restorative process could be, and we're working now on how we can expand that. So what we have is individual, we're really, really very fortunate because we have a circle of people who are extremely committed to ending the system, and many of whom come embedded in the process, who come into the circle with a restorative framework to begin with. So we have both activists and donors, some formerly incarcerated, some otherwise directly impacted, some who were volunteering and assisting. So we have like Jesse Estrin, who works inside prisons with long-timers, and And we have Mel Motel, who volunteered working inside schools to bring the restorative process there in Vermont. Charlene Allen used to work at Common Justice. Albino Garcia, who runs La Placita in Albuquerque, who brings indigenous practice there into the community to help young people, and who also goes into the prisons. George Galvis, working in Oakland, California with young people on restorative practice. And so we even have a consultant who herself, who themselves were going through a restorative process in a personal life. So we were just extremely, really fortunate to have people who really cared about that and who understood how life-affirming restorative practices could be. And that is to recognize that wherever people are, whatever harm that they have done, that it often comes out of trauma, and most importantly, it should not be the only defining thing that we know about them. That they still have much to learn, much to give, and much to contribute. And so that's been part of our funding model. So we start with those people sitting around the table, and so guess what? It's not surprising that we end up funding phenomenal work that's going on around the country. So we've been doing this now for 18 years, and we've been funding organizations that have leadership of directly impacted people, in particular also formerly incarcerated people, because they have a particular experience of incarceration that has informed their perspective on this current system we have and what needs to change and in what order, right? So we're extremely fortunate. We've been funding some work for quite a while, for years before, and now currently in a number of different programs. So in our general support program, we've been funding really phenomenal groups like Homies Unidos, who've been working with young people who have been involved with gangs or street organizations, as a lot of folks mentioned here, and also in Central America, right? So they've been working inside in prisons there to do basic things like just give people water, right, which they didn't have, as well as helping to support, work that was going on to bring truces about, and also to expose the level of trauma that young people were facing, in some cases death, when they were being returned deported from the United States. So that's just one example. And then we've been funding for many, many years the American Indian Prison Project Working Group, led by Stephanie Autumn. And she has been for years going into prisons, working with young people, giving them ceremony there, and then upon their return to community, establishing them in programs that include restorative practices, and then training them to help and assist others when they get out. So we're really happy about that work. But in addition to that, recently in 2017, we were able to begin another program with real help and support from a very visionary program officer at OSF, Gretchen Rohr, who really supported us in helping to bring an arrest diversion, a drug diversion program for pre-booking, pre-arrest. It had no coercive elements in it that required people to join this program so they could avoid incarceration. It was just asking community-based organizations, what kind of program would you need in order to really address the needs of your community that would result in them not being incarcerated, that they would not be put in cages to handle the problems that they're facing. And what we found there was that there was even more phenomenal work. Women with a Vision was creating, trauma-informed client programs for women who've been sex workers. We had Barrios Unidos, who was working with undocumented people and creating programs for them to address a number of issues that they were facing. And these programs were particularly designed to help people who are often facing drug involvement with alternative ways of working. The bottom line is that we know the overwhelming majority of people that are incarcerated have faced trauma, but we don't provide assistance for people to handle trauma so that they don't end up in prison, right? So people end up, doing all kinds of things. And what's really critical, I think, about CJI is that we've been able to recognize that when we talk to people about restorative options as opposed to incarceration, even those who are harmed will choose that over incarceration overwhelmingly. And so I think that we're then getting to a place where people see restorative practice as a real alternative, and that's critical. The thing that I wanted to say about funding sources is that I applaud the work that a lot of visionary folks have been able to do within the larger foundations. I think that it's really, let's just say it's been a long time coming, and it's really appreciated. But in addition to that, what's really exciting and I think encouraging, inspiring even, is the fact that there are lots of new pockets of money that are coming up from individual donors and family foundations who have been able to see, well, this system isn't working, let's try something else. They're willing to experiment. They're willing to try different novel approaches to this work. And I think that's really going to be the way to go. I think that that's going to allow us, the greatest degree of freedom to experiment. And then the people themselves will have to fund our own work, right? We will have to demand that our money goes to support programs that actually do affirm life instead of those that end up putting people in cages. So that's what I would say about that.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
Aleah, thank you so much. Anything else you want to say in the minute or so about a vision that you might have where you could imagine going in the future?
Well, I think that we're on our way, right? What we're finding is that more and more schools—
I'm sorry, may I interrupt you for a second?
Sure. Have I gone over?
There's someone typing behind you or close to you, and the audience is asking for a mute on that.
Okay, sorry, no problem.
Thank you so much.
What I was going to say was that I think that we're beginning to head in the right direction. We're beginning to head in the right direction, to be going down the correct journey. It makes absolute sense that we need to teach our young people how to deal with conflict and how to deal with forgiveness and how to deal with challenges, getting along, what to do about that. If we equip them with those skills as they grow, then they'll be able to exercise them as adults. But I think that we're very, very far from being able to recognize the role that trauma plays and the challenges we find in our society, right? Because we're just not willing to believe people when they say what's happened to them and that they've been harmed. If you look on the national stage right now, that's a good example of it. And we're not willing to provide people with what they need to heal. But we expect them to act as if they were never harmed. And that's just ridiculous and tragic. So that's what I see.
Thank you, Aleah. Absolutely. And I think part of what captures the imagination of the social movement concept is that the movement is more than just trying to reform an institution or change an institution. It's about a cultural shift.
Absolutely.
And I think once we can, if we could shift the goalpost from a punitive end goal, to a healing end goal, the systems would have to change there. But this is the vision. Seth, I'm gonna turn it over to you, and we'd love to hear from you on the two prompts we were talking about. So it's all yours.
Tough act to follow, but I love listening to Aleah, and actually, as I know, Gretchen will probably also say the CJI has been a great inspiration to me. And the funding entity that I'm now associated with, called Life Comes From It, which is just launching this fall. In fact, the first applications I think are going to be all submitted by next month, is really in a large part inspired by CJI, and I think it comes from this question of if restorative justice is a way that we can approach harm from an appreciation for our interconnectedness and an understanding that we can't punish our way into better behavior, and that an exclusively top-down model is not effective in the ways that we would like. Maybe that some of those lessons could be applied to philanthropy as well. And my experience working in philanthropy has been mostly with large foundations. And so my answer to these questions about what's cool and what is working and how might the future be is in part a learning from ways in which large foundations have often proven themselves to be highly idiosyncratic, and I think historically overly top down, and not for any malice, not because anybody wants to make things complicated, but just because as human beings, we often muddy the waters, as we try to work together. And so my fundamental message, my basic answer to these questions is that simple is stronger, and that the more relational we can make it, really the better. And I think the more honest. And I think good philanthropy, if we are transparent about it, really is about funding individual people, maybe the leadership in an organization or certain people who are influencers. And if we can establish relationships of trust where we really know each other, then good things can come out of that. And my experience is that we actually get more accountability than we do with reams of paper or online forms asking for reports or information for an application. And getting to know people and having a real conversation actually yields the best results. I have one story that I think of a lot from my early years, early days, even in philanthropy, which was a proposal we got from a youth, after-school youth mentorship program in Rochester, New York, and they were doing woodworking with young people, and they asked for a relatively small amount of money. They wanted to get some wood, some better wood, so they could make better products, and they could sell those maybe more successfully, and it helped fund their program. When we got up there and started talking to the people during a site visit before there was a decision made on the grant, we found out that the person who was running the program, number one, was incredible, was doing it completely out of love, had given up a previously held full-time position in order to do this part-time because he loved it so much, and was actually losing money. And that if we increased the size of the grant modestly, we could bring that person on full-time, and then he would be able to probably go and get wood donated, which he actually did. And he's still working there, and the program has expanded and really taken off because it's benefited from the time and attention of that really dynamic, genius person. And so that came out of building a relationship and really learning firsthand about what was going on, and not just reading on a piece of paper. So kind of in the spirit of how Aleah led us off, I'm just going to acknowledge some of the thinkers who influenced me around this. If people want to learn more, but there's an author named Orland Bishop who wrote a book called The Seventh Shrine that speaks to some of this. Lynn Twist, who wrote The Soul of Money. Bernard Laitier wrote The Future of Money. Nicanor Perlas, who's a social threefolding author in the anthroposophical tradition. Michael Mead, mythologist and storyteller with the Mosaic Multicultural Foundation. Miguel Rivera, who's a ceremonialist in Los Angeles. And what I've learned from these folks and others is that just as restorative justice is a community act, we can, as a community, resource our work. And foundations, as Aleah also said, is they're critical. They make so much possible. There's incredible people working there and do a lot of good, and we need them. But I think a lot of money gets left on the table with the individual donors. And for anybody who's on this webinar now who's trying to raise more money, I would suggest really think about who are people in your network or extended network who might have the capacity to give significantly to what your needs are, and try and get a meeting with them, try and get some time with them, see if you can visit with them and build a relationship and invite them into an understanding of the impact you're having and what it is you transform dollars into doing. What is that gift that you can do with money? And it's a simplified way of raising money, in a sense, because you often don't have to go through those same application forms. And it's generally true that maybe 90% of the funding for any initiative is coming from about 10% of the donors, or close to it. And so if we can really focus our attention on some of those folks, then we'll have more time to do the other work that we really love besides fundraising. And I wanted to say that also on the hierarchical model, the big organizations trying to make strategic philanthropy work well and using a lot of data, that even despite our best efforts, that doesn't result always in the best outcomes, or in the greatest amount of trust or the least amount of failure. I think, first of all, this money, philanthropic money, foundation money, and money from donors that's a gift, ought to be the most risk-tolerant money around. Failure should completely be an option. And if it's not, I think we really need to consider, what are we trying to do if we don't have the room to learn from doing something experimental that might come out differently than we would want or expect. And of course, I think we've all heard and are aware of stories of places, even with a lot of safeguards, where money gets misused or even abused. So it doesn't prevent that. I also think really good philanthropy is responsive, and that I think CGI is good at that. It requires us to have a low threshold for an application so that money can move when it is needed. And that includes when money has already been given, that it can change position. Things happen and we need to be able to pivot, and that comes out of trust. If a donor learns that there's a new situation, there's new context that makes the original plan not viable, what we need to do is work together to try and figure out how to redirect that. There's a couple of examples. So I'll pivot to the second question, Carl, about the future. There's a number of different groups that I think about. One is a previous organization that I got to work with called Project Home. And they work on the issue of homelessness in the Philadelphia area, and led by a really dynamic nun named Sister Mary Scullion. And one thing I learned from being around Project Home is that although they were really the biggest organization in that city working on that issue, they really understand that they cannot solve it on their own, and they're not going to make a big impact on their own. Even though they do great work and they draw down a significant amount of money, they actively, regularly re-grant with the consent of their donors to other organizations in their ecosystem. And it really does require an ecosystem. And I think restorative justice especially functions that way. We need folks who are working in all these different modalities to make this work, large and small and middle-sized, etc. Because it's our acknowledgement and an engagement in our relational health that makes this really work. So I learned that from Project Home. Also, there's a young guy named Edgar Jr. from Brazil who does social games, is the best way I can describe it, where the only rule coming into a community is when people are invited to, first of all, agree on a certain kind of issue that needs to be solved very locally. The one that I got to see firsthand was the construction of a playground. This one community really needed some playgrounds. They said, okay, the only rule is you can't use any money. Now what? You have 24 hours. That was the other part. And so that really helped people start to get creative about drawing down on social capital and really looking at, well, what if we agree as a community about what it is that's needed, what can we do without having to spend 1 cent? And within 24 hours, there's a playground. And more importantly, there's relationships and there's the experience of having created something collectively. And that's not to say that people shouldn't get paid, because obviously in this work, people need to get paid generally a lot more than we are. But that also, I think, shows that if we really look at our situation as one of collectivity, then a whole lot is possible. So I'll come back to Life Comes From It, this new fund, which is really a pooled fund specifically for the work of people doing restorative justice, transformative justice, and indigenous peace building, recognizing that these are issues that are deeply underfunded, maybe especially indigenous peace building, being that it's less than 0.3% of all philanthropic dollars are estimated to go to native causes, let alone native-led causes. And I think that this initiative, which is actually being led by a board of people who are practitioners, in an effort to really, in a sense, democratize the decision-making, will bring in more donors as the pool grows. There will be more money to go out to these causes, and hopefully it will be done with a lot of transparency, with a certain amount of humility, and with a recognition that, you know, the people making the decisions about where the money goes are not necessarily or even usually the smartest about those issues. It's usually the people who are closest to the problems and who are closest to the work. And so we want to really empower people to do what they see needs to be done. I'm not sure how much time I have, hopefully another minute or so. Am I getting close?
Sure. Yeah. We need to. Yeah. You have it's about time to move on. But yeah.
Okay, all right. I'll finish that one thought. Thanks, Paul. So there's an organization called Give Direct, which just moves cash basically, and they work in the rural parts of Kenya and Uganda primarily. They've been doing so for a while, and what they do is an unconditional cash gift to the poorest people in those regions using a mobile banking platform called M-Pesa. And so about a year's earnings comes to an individual on their cell phone. So nobody's taking any off the top. There's no middle people to intercept any of it. And the way that they've done this project is to say, use this however you see fit. We're going to ask you what you did, but there's no restrictions. And over a number of years now, we've seen that people who are poor are really smart about what they need to do with money. And so, I think that is a lesson for all of us around what philanthropy could be if we're willing to really lean into the discomfort of letting go of our control. So thanks for listening to me.
That's great. Thank you, Seth. I very much appreciate that. And thank you for highlighting Life Comes From It. This actually, we at the Zehr Institute are really pleased. This is one of the most tangible products that came out of a listening project that Seth and others were engaged in the early part of this year. And it just feels like a really appropriate process. And I encourage our folks who are in the webinar here, take a look at the website, lifecomesfromit.org, and you'll find out some more about the story, the people that are involved. And as Seth said, the first round of proposals are coming in by the deadline of October 15th. Gretchen, we want to hear from you. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hello. Thank you so much. It's just an absolute honor joining this conversation. I'm looking forward to it opening out to all the faces that I don't see, but I can't see Carl, Seth, and Aleah is enough. So even if it's the four of us talking, it's fine. Again, I'm with Open Society Foundations. I appreciate the outline with the bio. I do think that it is worth, one, always I try to, within any space that I enter, honor my teachers, those that I may not be aware of due to the wisdom and the stories that have translated themselves through those who I love and those who I may not feel all that much love for, but they're sure teaching me things in the land that I occupy here. But I do also have special gratitude for one of my original teachers in mindfulness practice, Ericka Huggins, and how her early introduction back in the 90s to me of meditation practices as a matter of liberating ourselves, not simply from the conditions of oppression, but actually from the response to those conditions. That the way in which she taught herself, the practices that she engaged and shared with so many others of her students, was to, as she always said, to ensure that they did not change her love for others, herself, and her capacity to hold on to her humanity. And I carry that lesson with me everywhere, and remembering that whether it is the practices specific to mindfulness, which was outlined in my bio, has been filtrated in different parts of my life, but I think restorative practices as those of other contemplative practices, those which result in what I would be teaching at the law school previously, or even the work that I was doing as a litigator, and remembering the lessons that I received from others, other educators, such as when representing Herman and Albert Woodfox, who Mr. Woodfox is still out today and teaching as well as Robert King. And as the Angola 3, they had so many lessons to teach us about just the power of relationship and its revolutionary impact. That there, if you don't know much about that campaign, it is one in which they as people built an ecosystem on love and faith, and it was not philosophical. It played a part in every interaction. So I would go to them as a snot-nosed attorney and think we're going to jump into like discovery and questions and how to fix things and how we're going to get them out of the situation. They're like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, how was your day? And these are the important lessons to carry when thinking through being in a space as a funder, and it's all about the money, and we just need to move the money. And I can fall into that. And I think most definitely when working within a very large foundation, having the privilege of a tremendous amount of resources, of the need to move in that way. So I did want to just make a note of that. And I did want to share just a screen here so you all don't have to look at my face the whole time. Are you seeing beautiful faces there? Okay, good. I wanted to outline just a few pieces in which we've been doing work through the portfolios that I've had the privilege to work on with Open Society Foundations for a few years. And recognizing that, yes, my departure from the courthouse was motivated by many things. Was motivated by, and I stated a bit in my bio, of even as a judge having the inability that so many others who share my skin color, share my experience of even preventing my closest loved ones from cycling through a system of incarceration. And I know that I have so much power, privilege that has been earned through my educational background. And relationships built, and that there is a value in how we administer these processes. I do believe in reform. I do believe that reform has its role, but I have chosen to invest my time in transformative systems change, which will, instead of shifting and kind of fixing some of the problems within a justice system, which was designed actually to maintain property ownership of me and people who look like me, to instead try to build out a system which really is truly reflective of the needs for justice of everyone. But by centralizing those who have been most harmed, that are most targeted, I was leaning into a faith and a belief that the solutions for everyone can come from those who are most harmed and most centrally targeted. We may talk later about how it's very important to remember that it is not simply just solutions about our own harm. I'm a survivor of sexual violence. I'm a survivor of targeted, racialized violence against my family. And I'm a survivor of deep harming from having loved ones spend time and cycle through behind bars. That does not mean that's the only thing I can speak on. And it also does not mean, so that I always have to remember that is not also what all of our partners that we hope to integrate and to move and shift social change can speak on. They can speak on economic justice shifts. They can speak on many other areas other than just trauma-informed responses and responses to reducing harm and bringing healing to our communities. I then also, yes, want to thank Aleah, the work of CJI. And I met Aleah, she was not my first contact with CJI, which also speaks to the power of it. I heard about CJI in a meeting with other folks who were participants in the circle. And the fact that they are so empowered at their consensus-based governance allows for them to have the gall to come up and be like, yo, y'all need to be working with CJI and you need to be talking with CJI. And everything you're talking about is really what we've been doing for 17 years, by the way. That co-leadership is critical because Aleah can't be everywhere and do everything. And so that is something that I am actually still struggling with in building out really strong partnerships, integrating those who are most directly impacted within the systems and decision-making. I'm making a goal. I did a transformation of my portfolio where about 50% of all funding in my portfolio is now in the hands of those who are impacted by the systems that we do fund. My goal is to increase that by 10% each year. The challenge is that is not always the answer because where are the relationships shifting? How am I shifting? How can I lead, support, and shift even within open society foundations? And how much can I be self-congratulatory mistakenly of a really strong, wonderful, collaborative, consensus-built meeting and deny the power dynamics that still continue to operate because people know these funds, this trend, I would say, of participatory funding in particular, will have its end. And what we make of it right now is key. How we can use it, get it out of a moment and really shift this to movement. So the basis of the shift in our portfolio really leaned heavily, most definitely, on the teachings and the writings that do come out of Zehr Institute. Thank you so much for that. But we particularly leaned into much of what has come out of the sexual survivors movement, Generation 5's definition of transformative justice. Miriam Kaba was brought in as our key designer. and almost anything that is of any wisdom that I may say here, it means that I've just stolen it from her. Anything that you read that's from me, it means I've stolen it from someone. Because I really did not want to and did not trust myself to reinvent anything, but just to try to how to pull together and figure out what could be done. So just briefly to make it really clear as to how we see transformative justice distinguishing itself somewhat from restorative justice. And many of these things are the same. So absolutely it prioritizes. We prioritize safety, healing, and agency for survivors. We prioritize accountability and transformation for people who harm. Community action, healing, and accountability, which is really key when you're looking at communities that there has been a broad-based harm. Baltimore and DC and our gun violence initiatives are key examples of that. You can't just find one individual, it's not an interpersonal harm. And then lastly, Generation 5's definition stipulates that one of the values is the transformation of the social conditions that perpetuate violence, systems oppression and exploitation, domination, and state violence. So we place violence at the forefront in the score. It was to fill the gap of a lot of the work we've been doing on drug policy and our work on trying to reduce and redress the criminalization of those who are drug involved and engaged in the sex trade, as well as recognized by Aleah in our partnership with them. We felt we need to go more deeply here. We've all had way too many people and too many loved ones that are caught up in the system. And quite honestly, our system of mass incarceration will never, it can't even touch where other countries are if you believe even in the use of incarceration. We couldn't even get our numbers down to where the rest of the globe is if we did not address violence and violent offenses and charges. We created 2 different pieces in this new portfolio. And we created one side where we focused in 3 different cities to really test out some really amazing and intense new planning and ideas to transform and really to replace the use of police, prisons, and state surveillance. And we are doing that in Durham, North Carolina, and Washington, D.C., and in Miami. We're expanding to Los Angeles in a partnership that's been continuing with organizations with all 4 of those cities. And they were provided with support in just money to just plan to plan. Funding to not even have to come up with an idea, not even come up with a proof of implementation, but to build out community imagination, build out partnerships. One of the key aspects, and again, this gets to the way in which we're hoping to shift our work, was to cultivate partnerships, that we were not accepting applications from any organization that would not demonstrate that they had at least 2 other partners in the community on board, and that at least one of them had management that constituted at least 50% of individuals who have survived criminalization or a period of incarceration. And so in each of our cities, those partnerships were key, and that would also ensure, not just as a partner, but also as if you have 3 organizations, they are receiving at least 1/3 of the resources. So they would not be tokenized, and they have a responsibility to lead these initiatives, co-lead these initiatives. How am I on time?
You're fine. Just a few more minutes, and then we'll head for the Q&A. And I want to say to the folks out there, start sending in your questions, please, using the Q&A button, because we're gonna head in there in a few minutes.
Thank you.
Gretchen?
Thanks. So yes, one side was looking at the cities. The other side, which was a creation of a new donor advised fund, which did engage a participatory grant making method. We call it the peer-to-peer exchange. And so that is what beautiful photo you're seeing in front of you. This is our first cohort. The cohort members, oh, did you lose me or the video?
on, Gretchen.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if you guys can see the video of the list of the organizations. So yeah,
We'll try to get that organized.
Okay. I can hit share again.
Yeah, why don't you do that?
Yeah, maybe it will. Maybe that's what happened here. Okay.
And Gretchen, your mic sometimes goes in and out. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Maybe it's because of the movement. So you might want to just hold on the movement just a little bit, or stabilize the mic in some way.
Thank you. So
she's an enthusiast.
I know. I really hate to say stabilize the movement. So just hold the mic. That's what I'm asking.
So I'm hoping that you are still you're seeing this, the list of grantee organizations. There are 21. They're all too powerful and amazing for me to list a couple. It's like, it's not possible. So I really definitely want to make sure that you all get the links to learn about their projects. But they were chosen as all individuals who are under the age of 30 primarily. But we did recognize those who have spent the majority of their development years behind bars were given an exception to that rule. They're all survivors of violence, and we defined violence very broadly, but we targeted specifically the forms of violence that we know are actually generating and driving mass incarceration, and that includes gender-based violence. That most also includes state-based violence. This group, powerful sort. We had an application process that did gain from a lot of lessons I've learned from others. We allowed people to submit video applications, spoken word, art-based, but they did have to have a project to transform a piece of violence within their community and reduce the addiction to prisons, police, and state surveillance. These were our selection committee members. They were also a powerhouse team. It was such a pleasure working with them. We ensured 2 of the members, including specifically Robert and Angel, were young individuals. And I have to say that, yeah, I was guilty of turning to them whenever one of the interviewees would give us like, a spoken word presentation about what they're really compelled about. And then they turn to us and say, now I'd like y'all to each give me 6 bars, please. Could not do it. So I learned I need to step up my spoken word game, evidently, if I'm going to allow for others to speak on their passion in restorative and transformative justice in that manner through essays, because they would like it more to be of a communal thing and not a performative. And I say that in jest, but it is quite true. There can be a performative aspect of young people in particular being requested to share an artistic expression of social justice, faith, and belief, and that not being integrated into the components of where the work will ultimately go. So yeah, this here are the descriptions of the different projects that they are doing. What we are funding is some general support for them, but then also funding for them to exchange time with each other, to learn from each other the tactics. We are trying to turn upside down this TA assistant from the top down, and for them to learn from each other, have time visiting each site and sharing tactics. But what we have learned already, and why we did focus on investing in their capacity building instead of just dumping some money into demonstration sites. We are happy with our demonstration sites on the other side of the portfolio, but for this one, we knew we needed to cultivate more of a movement and leadership building, is that there is still a lot of patterns of training and support that they need. And so what we've made with some adjustments is that absolutely, yes, we're incorporating we're partnering now with Resilient Strategies, which is a newly evolving work by some who are former Soros Justice Fellows to deliver on the ground for organizers how to integrate healing justice practices within their approach. We are funding an initiative in which Ericka Woodland with the Trans and Queer Therapists of Color Network will be building out a micro grant process for communities who are survivors of gun violence specifically. We are building out also a partnership with Forum Design, well, actually designing justice with Deanna Van Buren and her partners there to actually help with build out of infrastructure and a shifting so we can build the cities and the communities that we envision are necessary. Build it and they will come, we hope, necessary for transformative justice. Instead of everybody going to volunteer at jails because that's one place you know you can find the people who have greatest need. I used to be a person who taught about meditation in jails. I had to quit it because I felt that it was actually humanizing a system that I just had no faith was actually supporting people's humanity. And so instead, I do believe volunteers and folks who really want to be engaged, community members, they need a place to go to be able to support a new justice paradigm. And I really do believe the vision of these architects are trying to build that. And so just quickly onto where we should go. We are working here very closely at trying to build out and hire and shift our hiring. We did produce a very strong report in partnership with the Executive Alliance on how philanthropy needs to shift our hiring approaches, ensuring that more people who are directly impacted are employed. I hope it does not come off as any matter of ego, but I do believe the fact that this is just my life work is one reason why there will never be a shift in me believing that this is important work. Whatever pressures come outside, I'm willing to fight them, to fight very hard. And I think that the more people who are in philanthropy, where it is their life work to do this, that's how we can know that it won't be co-opted, that it won't just shift from in a trend, that there really is a decolonization of that approach. But I also know I have so much to learn and I'm so ignorant. Just was talking, we're also funding the Third Wave Sex Worker Giving Fund, and I was meeting with Ra Young, just brilliant designer of the supports of that fund. And I had no idea of the history of foundations similar to mine endowing these community foundations like Aleah's. I had no idea of the history of endowment that now has been discontinued. And that's something I need to learn more about, because I don't want to fool myself into thinking we're building something new when in fact so much of this I think was structured in the past. We need to look at what was dismantled and why. And I know there's a spectrum of philanthropy, and so I just believe the future is recognizing that spectrum can operate, and I do know it operates already within my foundation. There's so many people in my foundation, particularly in Spain and other spaces, that have been engaging in participatory funding, participatory budgeting process, participatory justice work that we're trying, I'd love to learn from. And that also, I really love Seth's invitation, particularly for me to join in this and for us on our continuing conversation about our funds, because we are looking and we are committed to eliminating that competition that can unintentionally arise when different funds come up. We all want the same thing. And the greater work and way we can align information for everybody to make a choice as to how to support and align, I think the better. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Gretchen. Fantastic. So, folks, this has been some rich input, and I know there's got to be some questions rattling around. We have one on here that I'm going to jump into, but really thank you for the spectrum of responses and thoughts from each of you. The work that you're doing is incredible. We applaud it, and it gives me a lot of hope to hear the language shifting, the sense of what is this funding involve, who are the players, who are the actors, and how do we work together without this sort of competitive turf battle language, and I'm just pleased with a whole set of things that are coming out of this conversation. So I'm inviting our folks out in the cyber audience to come in with your questions. Remember, using the Q&A below. I'll try to take the questions as they come, group some together if they're similar. We do have one right now coming from one of our participants. thanking us for the presentation. She says, forgive my ignorance here, but can you please explain what costs are involved in launching a community-based RJ program? I know training can be costly, but assuming we have public space and support from local government and law enforcement, as well as volunteer support for operations, what costs should we anticipate? Anyone want to jump in and give Kate some feedback there? There's a lot of places to enter that question.
Well, I'll start just by saying I think the costs are very low. In the way the question was presented, if we assume we have a place to do it and some people to do it, that's the primary thing. The little bit I learned about restorative justice work in schools in particular is that's what's really needed. Consistency is manifestation. If we have a room for there to be a restorative response to something that's happened, if the classrooms themselves are places where there's some restorative practice happening regularly, if there's people who are even taking turns being the point people responsible for ensuring that there is a restorative practice alive in that institution, then it percolates into the culture. And I think one good answer to the question Carl asked about the future of this work is that the government pays for this, that this becomes more of the mainstream, that we have public funding. You have Canada, New Zealand, much of Europe, right, Australia. This is something that happens. There's a federal program for restorative justice in Canada. I've been there. In Ottawa, there's an office where people are doing this full time, murders included. And so I think that is a goal, that philanthropy helps us all enter places that collectively we may be nervous about. And if you have an agreement in a justice ecosystem, I'm sure Gretchen could speak to this a little bit as a former judge, that if you have the different people who are involved in that process agreeing that something else is possible, then I think the costs are very low. I wouldn't put an exact dollar figure on it abstractly, but yeah, I think that's my first response.
Can I just jump in? I think
Gretchen, yeah. Oh.
Yeah, I think absolutely there's so many opportunities to resource, but I do want to also emphasize the importance of starting really small. And one of the challenges that many people have with resourcing is that resource providers oftentimes dig at you to demonstrate expansion of scope and impact. And even anticipating that pushes a lot of people away from wanting to do it. And those who do it oftentimes lose the depth of their impact while trying to expand scope and numbers. And one way to address that is, and again, Miriam Kaba really suggests going to her website and some of her trainings. She gives just some of the most basic examples to the grantees that we work with, is to changing our concept of really what's restorative justice, and how almost all of these trainings and lessons and approaches are indigenous to all of us. We do not, it's like talk to your ancestors on your own space, or talk to your mama, your grandma. They found ways to get around. And it does not always require significant amount of resources. But one example that she gave that I just love is it's okay, you're living in a big apartment building and you are sick of hearing people getting beaten up next door, but you do not want to call the cops. What do? It is a completely cost-free process of organizing your building to create a phone tree of people who are willing to answer the phone when you're in that situation and you don't know what to do. And it's not like they're gonna, oh, let's all go gun blazing into that apartment, but they're gonna sit down with you and help you think through, okay, what should I do? It's that you're not alone in the decision. And that process, thinking through how to reduce the harm, how to connect to the resources that might actually have more of a circle process associated. But even those first steps and reactions and responses to violence, which are trying to take into consideration the needs of everyone, that's restorative justice in my mind. That's an approach in my mind.
That's great. Thank you, Gretchen.
I would like to also speak a little bit about what I'm feeling now here at CJI, which is that, you know, as we bring in more and more directly impacted people into our processes who, as we mentioned earlier, many of whom have experienced intense trauma, not just the people who are directly impacted by the criminal justice system, but just people, right, in general. What I'm wanting to do is build out systems within philanthropy that help prepare and foster restorative justice within the group of people who are doing the collective grant making, right? I feel like there are elements of that work that have been healing for some. You know, just the fact that they're sitting across the table from somebody who does not share their background, does not share their experience, and that person seems also very committed to this work. It's been a healing thing for a number of people who have said that. And I'm speaking from the part of both donors and activists and formerly incarcerated people. But it's also true that in order for us to be able to sit down and listen to each other and to talk to one another, that we also have to make room for the trauma that's coming with us. And we have to understand how to handle that when it shows up. Because the bottom line is that it will show up. It will show up in lots of different ways and often in places and times that we would most like it not to. And so I feel like we should be more proactive about trying to really think through what kinds of things we can put in place to help handle that, so that when it shows up, we already know what to do. We have those skills. We've already discussed it. We recognize it. We understand what we're seeing, and we know what to do. And so that's one of the things that CJI has been committed to trying to really think through in the coming year and years, I should say, because we really feel like the model is really critical, that we work together, that we sit down and reason together. And it's also therefore important for us to speak to each other, to interact with one another, to hear each other as actual fellow human beings and not just as people who are coming with this or that or the other skill and work to do together, but are actual human beings who are coming with their own life experiences. And that helping to understand that is going to help us understand not just the work that we're trying to decide on, but how we can create a society and a community that's actually, you know, again, life affirming instead of, you know, commodifying.
Thank you, Aleah. We've got 4 questions here, so they've come in. So maybe I'm going to throw a few of them out, and I'll let one of you jump in and answer them, and probably keep moving them through so that we can get to each of those. We've got a question here from David. We have an ongoing program housing former life sentence individuals. Most foundations are not interested in ongoing funding, so we are pursuing government funding as well. But we see little interest in funding for older, past violent, past sexual, now transformed, wonderful people.
Yeah.
Big fishing for some, maybe some advice. Anyone want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I definitely think you should look to the government for funding in that community. But I also think that that there's a way of transforming whom you're talking about, and the reality is that they probably have lots to share with other people and maybe could be perceived as folks who could share with younger folks or with other people who might be, you know, at risk to have a similar experience about what the options to avoid are, right? Because it's a lot more difficult for people young people, old people, any people, to dismiss someone who's walked down that path than it is for them to just to dismiss someone who doesn't appear to ever have faced some of the challenges that those folks have faced and come through. So I would suggest thinking about them as people who could tell their story in a way that could help other people, right?
And can I jump really quickly on that? Also, I completely agree. I think that the situation that organizations like this one may be put in, and I myself was in an organization that, was engaging folks with housing and supportive housing as a form of reentry, and is also delivering advocacy services, is that I do think one of the things I'm most hopeful about is in the field is that funders are starting to recognize that a direct service does not necessarily mean that there's not also opportunity for systemic change and advocacy as a piece.
Yeah.
And many organizations that did have both pieces before let go of advocacy to try to get the governmental money. And so you may also want to consider, I'm not saying that this is the answer for you, I do not know the circumstances, but whether a bringing back and an incorporating and addressing what are some of the advocacy pieces can also support your resourcing, because the charitable model of just delivering the housing and delivering it and delivering it and delivering it is true. Private funders typically are not going to jump into that. But there are many who are looking at how to build out that model so that it can become self-generating, how to shift, there's this amazing, just right here actually, genius piece that just came out from the ESSE project, just looking at, the costs of caring for individuals who are coming out of incarceration. This is an advocacy issue that many feel like this should be about tax credits. This should be that there are other ways around ensuring that people who are in that space can have resources. I also recognize, because of the segregation and because of so many people being pushed out of spaces where they have lived before, when they do have the sex offense registry as an additional barrier, they're quite unique. But I hope that you won't feel you have to cut off relationship with the advocates to pursue that governmental fund.
That's great, thank you. Kirby here asks about, and we have someone participating from Nepal who asked a similar question, but could anyone speak to what is the kind of data that you collect to leverage funding? In other words, and what are and she has two questions here. Also, are there gaps in what data funders look for and what your organizations that you're funding are able to choose to provide? A little bit about, our friend from Nepal said that so often donors, when they approach them for support, are asking for immediate and quantifiable output.
Mm.
And how do we deal with this when it comes to RJ projects?
I can jump in, but I feel like I've talked too much.
No, that's fine. Gretchen, jump in.
Okay, so we have created, we identify questions, and what we've done is we've really tried to build out some models for the grantees to reflect on the questions and the ways in which we would be identifying progress. But these are inquiries, and it's really for them to first establish, okay, what is your baseline? Where are your objectives? And then trying to build out relationships with them, with other experts who could then help them identify their own milestones. It makes, we don't have identifiable monetary outputs within at least the portfolios that I've been speaking of, but we do have very high standards really about the value and showing that you are making progress moving towards a value. So one specific piece, for example, even the examination of centralizing the leadership of those most directly impacted. That is extremely controversial and very difficult. Many people have very different ideas as to how to define that. Aleah and I are always going back and forth, learning, figuring out how to ask the question in a different way, because you just can't ask directly impacted, because everybody says they're directly impacted. And then if you really do believe that there should be prioritization for some funding for those who have been excluded previously, you need to be explicit it all depends also about the trust of the relationship. I was blown away what I heard the third wave asks of their grantees. And it really, again, reminded me that it is not about the amount of stuff that's asked. It's about the relationship and the trust that's been built, and them knowing how it's used. And so I could ask for very few things, but if I have not operated in a way, or my institution has not operated in a way where people feel they can trust, particularly when we're working with a lot of sex workers and the convening to figure out how to really support them, one meeting and asking for the input and the information is not going to work.
Yeah, I'd also like to say that CJI has intentionally tried to simplify the way that we ask questions about what would otherwise have been a really huge critical issue around evaluations and quantifying work. And so what we just say now is, how would you define success in what you're doing? How will you know if it's working or not working? So that they can identify beforehand what they consider to be a good outcome, and then they can therefore determine whether they've been able to reach that or not. And we've made it really clear in lots of different ways to our applicants that we really do want to know what's not working, not because we're going to be punitive against you, but because this is really helpful to us. We're trying to help support a movement. And so it's helpful to us to learn if something is working or something is not working, that we have tried it. If we're really going to be creative and innovative about how we solve the problems that got us in this situation that we're in now, then we know that we're going to have to keep thinking outside the box. We're going to have to try new things, and some things will work and some things won't work. And we're not going to be, chastising and punitive to people who are doing that incredible work, because we know that it's hard. It's really hard. And so I think that the most important thing I would say to someone is to identify what you consider to be markers of success, and then what you consider to be ways in which you'll be able to say that those markers have been reached or not reached, and why you think they weren't reached, because identifying why something didn't work can be just as helpful, in some cases more helpful, than identifying something that did work if we don't know why it did. So that's what I think.
Thank you very much. Just a real quick one to run down, maybe each of you, if you have an idea. Our friend from Nepal asked, do you have ideas for funding for movements, RJ projects, or movements outside of the US? For those based in a country like Nepal? Any?
Martine Barreau Fund used to help people who were doing work on mental health illness, like trauma survivors that were trying to do some sort of restorative work. I think that that's an international fund. It's kind of small, but I think that it might be something that's still around and still working.
All right.
I want to make sure people also know about the Foundation Center.
Oh yeah, that's good.
It's an online tool. They have some free versions, but you can do keyword searches. I think restorative justice is one of the search terms, but certainly criminal justice reform, and it'll help you identify funders who are funding in different geographic areas and then on different topic areas. And I think also there's something, maybe Aleah and Gretchen, you've noticed this as well. There's been a kind of remarkably absent coordination of criminal justice reform funders.
Yes.
For all these other issues, but somehow this one has been late to the way. So that's something that, again, going against your work. And I also want to just go back to David's question. I think also what our friend from Nepal was asking, which is basically, how do you find donors when this is an unpopular subject, right? If we're working with people who are formerly sex offenders or labeled sex offenders or life sentences and are now home and nobody's interested in them, I think we have to be creative about ways to build relationships, as has been said many times here. And I actually know David, and know the Francisco Holmes Project there in Bend. They have a beautiful garden. They do an amazing re-entry ceremony for people coming home. They have these wonderful house meetings. And so, I think actually Defy Ventures is one that's been good at this. A lot of organizations in creating relationships between groups that often don't get a chance to meet, and to overcome these stereotypes and these fears and these stories that can divide. And I think also about data, I don't know who said it, but there's lies, damn lies, and statistics.
Yes.
So, and I've, as somebody who's tried to raise money for my own program before, I know exactly what it is to say, well, how many people benefited from this grant? Was it just the kids, or maybe it was their parents too? Maybe it's the, So it's really easy just to find ourselves making stuff up to try to make it look good, And so I really like stories. And I think, second to relationships, stories help us connect with the spirit and the heart of what is going on. So maybe try that.
I would throw out, I apologize because my brain is not in that. I'm thinking of a few that are powerful international funders that are really cultivating these days. But I do know that digging into, you mentioned about criminal justice, I think the health space and health funders, that where they're looking at isolation. And so I think the search is not for restorative justice funding. The search is search out what the problem is. And it is, I think, easier to find funders who are willing to address that problem. And then you are proposing, RJ, as a solution, because there are a lot that are looking more about like the health impacts of isolation, of conflict resolution. I know Open Society Foundation has significant resources on safety, security, conflict resolution. We also have significant resources, and as you know, many others have built out, like Ford, major new initiatives relating to arts and culture change. All of these pieces can fit within, but I think that the key piece is speak to other organizations and who are the ones who are doing the stuff that you really believe in, and ask them and come together and maybe pursue together, see if they're willing to share that information.
All right, thank you. We are running out of time. I'm really sorry for that, but we are. There was one last question, and it was specifically to Gretchen, just to say, and I'm going to summarize because it was a little bit long, from Anna, that just said, we are running an RJ program. Let's see, it's a diversionary program in the Brooklyn Criminal Court in New York, Peace Institute. They have a lot of volunteers who don't necessarily aren't representing the most represented population. Do you get what I'm saying? They're not representing the folks they're working, and they're doing incredible work, reaching a lot, but they've actually had funders starting to turn them away because the volunteers were not representing the constituencies they're trying to work with. And she's saying, how would you pose a language back to them as they're trying to actively work on diversifying their volunteer base?
The volunteers.
But what about the people who are experiencing the program?
Yeah.
I would say that, I mean, if it's about to the volunteers and this is a situation, I can't speak to their example. I can say I've been in the same situation where I've operated or I've been advising on a program. When you have a volunteer-based program, you are only going to be able to draw from the people who have the resources to not work full-time or 2 or 3 jobs. So you first need to dig into the problem as to why you have to do this as volunteer labor. If the people who are most directly impacted and benefiting from the work you're doing care and are benefiting from it, it would be an organizing model and they would be committing their lives to doing it. If it's only people who are on the outside committing and it's more of a charitable model, you may want to look at where is the impact. Absolutely getting more resources there to hire people to come in can address that, but it just adds and it does not take away. And so sometimes it requires very critical and difficult conversations about when people want to support RJ or support anything that is meant to change systems that harm. We don't all have the same role. We don't all facilitate. I shifted from facilitating to funding. And maybe that's what some of those folks need to do. Like that there are different roles everybody can play. They don't have to be the one in the room facilitating. And then the final, how to gauge the success of your model. I gauge the success of the model of us trying to create and train up survivors of violence coming from behind bars to start facilitating RJ circles.
Right.
By how many are the graduates becoming the teachers? And when we were not seeing that, we shut it down. We shut it down and integrated into other programs, because we can't have too many programs out there. They actually detract from the ability for funders to resource them all. So partner with folks who you feel like are doing it right.
All right. Thank you very much, panelists. This was fantastic. Really appreciate it. We have gone over time a little bit. I'm going to turn it over to Michaela to take us through a few announcements. For those who've stayed on, I appreciate it. I'm sorry we're going over a few minutes this week, but I think it was a worthwhile conversation and so much appreciate all of the inputs that we had here. Michaela, over to you.
Yes, thank you everybody who participated in this webinar. It's really appreciated. Hi, my name is Michaela Waters-Crittenton, and I'm a graduate student for the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And I'm the graduate assistant for the Zehr Institute, and I have just a few announcements for you guys. So this is a list of our upcoming webinars. They are hosted between 4:30 and 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So we hope you make a note of the dates and can join us for our future webinars. Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience, otherwise known as STAR, is a research-based training program that brings a lot of different fields together, such as neurobiology, conflict transformation, human security, and restorative justice. The program is designed for individuals and organizations whose work brings them into contact with populations who are dealing with current and historic trauma. These are the dates for upcoming trainings, and if you'd like more information, please follow the link at the bottom of the page. We offer a graduate certificate that is 18 credit hours with equal focus given to conflict analysis and practice. The certificate can be completed through a number of courses offered through our annual Summer Peacebuilding Institute, or through a combination of one semester on campus and one summer term. Again, for more information, please visit our website at CJP. If you're interested in the intersection between restorative justice and education, there are two options available to you. One is a Master's of Arts in Education with the Restorative Justice Education concentration, or a 15-hour graduate certificate in RJ Education that can be used for a variety of professionals working in educational settings. We also offer a Master's in Conflict Transformation and a Master's in Restorative Justice. The curriculum is practice-based and ideal for individuals who are looking to be reflective practitioners within their chosen field. Last but certainly not least, the Zehr Institute website is available as a source for upcoming events, resources, and a schedule for our upcoming webinars. It's also a repository for past webinars that are linked to YouTube. The recordings for tonight will be available within the next 48 hours, so you can check there. That concludes all of my announcements, and I'll turn it back over to Dr. Stauffer for a few closing comments.
Thank you all for coming out. Thank you to the three panelists. This has opened up, I think, a new conversation in many ways. I think it sparked some new ideas. There's some great new language out there, and I'm just hoping that we can continue to use the momentum from this webinar to keep building the movement. And so thank you all who came out and joined us for this webinar, and we hope you'll join us for the next ones coming up in October, November, and December. Everyone have a good evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
To everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.